Should we start, sir? Uh, I'll just introduce the speakers and then we'll give the control to you. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining in on the 7th edition of the webinar series, NCGG webinar series on public policy and good governance. This time, we are honored to collaborate with the two eminent speakers from IIT Jodhpur. Our first speaker is Professor Krishna Kumar Balaraman, sir. He is current associate professor at School of Management and Entrepreneurship at the prestigious IIT Delhi, IIT Jodhpur. He specializes in strategic and public policy area and is affiliated with IIT Jodhpur Center for Technology, Foresight and Policy. He is a PhD from IIT Madras. He also holds an MBA from IIM Bangalore uh, and a postgraduate diploma in intellectual property right from National Law School of India University. Before transitioning to academia, Sir has over 2 decades of international leadership experience in developing products and solutions in advanced technology. So today, Sir will be speaking on strategic foresight and policy. Our second eminent speaker is Dr. Venkat Ram Reddy, Sir. He is an assistant professor at School of Management and Entrepreneurship at Indian Institute of Technology, Jodhpur, specializing in human capital and organizational dynamics. His research interests span behavioral science, judgment and decision making, intelligence, rationality, and the implication of artificial intelligence on human behavior and organizational systems. Prior to his gig with IIT Jodhpur, he served as a faculty member in organization management area at IIT Delhi. He holds a master's of science and PhD in management science, and his work integrates insights from disciplines such as economics, neuroscience, and organizational theory. Sir will be speaking on AI education and policy. Welcome to you too, sir. So for the first session, we have Dr. Krishna Kumar Balaraman, sir. He will be speaking on strategic foresight policy. As the people who have joined in, they know the process. We will have the two speakers giving their insight on the given topics. And then if any of the participants have any questions during the session, they can post it in the chat box and we will take the questions at the end. So the control is to you, sir. Balaraman, sir, it's you now.
Thank you, Dr. Rastogi. Is my screen visible, the share screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for this opportunity. Thanks to NCGG, and I'm glad to be here to share some of my thoughts and hope to be enriched by some of the interactions we would have here. The topic broadly is strategic foresight and policy. And if you want to look at what is, if you look at from a perspective, what is the current context, why we are looking at foresight as a topic, is that we are in a situation where the country is aspiring to be a developed nation by 2047. And the government has given its vision. It's a preferred future of a technology-driven and knowledge-based economy. At the same time, it also wants to be proactive and act on opportunities and embrace new technology to contribute to national development. And this is in the context of both the social, political, economic context of where India is right now and where they would like India to go in 2047. And why is IIT Jodhpur very interested in this topic? Is we have a Center of Technology, Foresight and Policy. We're looking at foresight as both as a capability and methodology to look at preferred futures and work on it. And the agenda of CTFP, Center of Technology, Foresight and Policy, is basically to evangelize foresight in both the public and private space in India so that we make better policies or more robust policies and relevant policies as we speak. Now, to set a context, what is foresight? Of course, an English word, but in the context of research and in the context of formality for all of us to get into a common parlance, it's basically an ability to visualize alternate futures. And this can be both at the individual level and at the organization level. I will come to that a little bit further because foresight can be at various levels. All of us do possess certain kind of, because of our expertise, are able to anticipate, visualize, and sometimes even plan for preferred futures or anticipated futures, as we call it. And foresight as a conscious capability can help us to sense environmental changes. Environmental here is in terms of society, politics, technology, legal, a bunch of stuff, and then perhaps take relevant actions um, for either developing or acquiring those required assets and skills so that we are able to handle dynamic futures, or at the same time create some capabilities which gives us the ability to reach where we want to reach. In this case, for example, Viksit Bharat 2041, that's a goal we want to reach and what all we need to do. And policy plays an extremely important part in that. And more important about foresight is that it's a collaborative process because there are so many aspects which we are looking at that various participants will bring various expertise and also different levels in the organization, right? Each one has a different experience, different inputs are coming to them. Now, how do we collaboratively and participatively able to accumulate or aggregate that level of knowledge about what are the possible future paths which may evolve? So foresight can, again, I'm going to see that as a whole overall concept. It can be seen as a holistic. In fact, I think European Union has a foresight group, which research foundation works on the foresight group. Countries have foresight teams like UAE, Singapore, US, and even India has used a lot of foresight. But again, as a formal effort, we need to maybe strengthen a bit of it in terms of both developing that capability at various levels across the hierarchy. At the same time, looking at it from using regular methods, a combination of regular foresight methods which can inform us better. Now, strategic foresight in the context is ability to create and maintain a high quality, coherent and functional forward view. It's a forward orientation, it's temporal orientation, and to use the insights arising in useful organizational ways. In this case, our organization, if you take country as an organization, and we have a lot of bureaucracy which runs it, we have a policy which runs it, so we can look at how strategic foresight is very important even for us at the country level. And if you take it from organization level, firm level, we get organizational foresight. Teams level, we have managerial foresight, and of course, each one of us bring our own view of the future based on our experiences and analysis of information available. Now, the question is, how is foresight different from forecast or hindsight, right? Forecast, formally speaking, is still based on past data, whereas foresight is looking at weak signals, the current situation, both societal, political, legal, technologically, and looking at weak signals, looking at trends which are happening, and then create a view of the future of these are the possible pathways where the future is going. And hence, while the foresight, which is in some sense also the hindsight, informs us of what happened and what didn't happen in a particular context, it does not, it has the advantage, the hindsight has the advantage of outcome knowledge, whereas a foresight does not have an advantage of outcome knowledge, whereas we are trying to create preferred outcomes, right? So also, there are structural differences in the way we look at hindsight / foresight, if you will, and hindsight / forecast and foresight. So there are a lot of foresight-based exemplars from India itself. For example, our constitution. If you see, there's been a huge amount of debate. In fact, if you want to visualize our constitution as a policy document for our country, in some sense, because of which we exist as a country and we function as a country, we excel as a country. If you want to put it in a perspective, it guides us, right? The policy document guides us in some sense. It is one of the, if you go through the constitution creation process, you will see that it's been debated over few years, actually, almost close to 3 years before it was accepted. And they were very, very forward looking, looked at various scenarios. And even now of course, a lot of amendments have taken place in certain sections, but they also gave that facility in the document as a policy document to be dynamic in terms of interpretation and also in terms of being relevant to the times which come. And that is a beauty of a policy document, right? It's not so rigid. It gives a guidance at the same time, it gives a focus. At the same time, depending on the situation, it also gives certain amount of degrees of freedom for you to evolve. the sub-policies of the policies. And of course, we had, in some sense, from a statistical sense, the National Sample Survey, which was started in 1930s, again, Professor Mahalanobis. It was again to estimate from the acreage and crop yield by random sampling. That's a technique which is very effective in the statistics space, but again, using past data, how they're able to create future pathways. Now, what is it? How do we see foresight? Because usually when we make strategy or sometimes even policy, the time dimension is largely neglected. Neglect is not that you don't take a time dimension, but what is a time dimension required is almost restricted to how much you can visualize it. So typically we look at 3 years, 5 years, or maybe in some industries like infrastructure, maybe we look at 20 years. It is contextual. But when we talk about policy, some of the policies are supposed to be for long term, very long term, and the way it is looked at needs to have a view whether it is trying to solve just current problems or it is also trying to tap future opportunities. And here's where the aspect of the temporal dimension, the time dimension comes when we are looking at foresight and looking at, and if we use foresight and the policy, if our policy is supposed to, of course, address maybe relatively current problems, at the same time also you look at future opportunities in that sector, in that area, or as a country as a whole, we need to start getting time dimensions. So for example, right now we have 2047 in India. It is very difficult for many people to visualize, which is almost like 20 years down the line, given that many of the policy makers usually are, in some sense, they are looking at a 3 to 5 year time frame because that's a tenure in a particular position. If I look at from a governmental system kind of thing, right? So it's difficult, and everybody is looking at their immediate solving current problems. How do they, and also how they would be viewed in terms of what they achieved. So they like to, more closer you are to a time frame, the more you think you'll be able to achieve, because further you are, it's very difficult to visualize because it's a long-term game. But yet, it depends on what kind of hat we wear for policy making with respect to the time frame, the future orientation, and the strategic decision. Again, it's coming from a foresight perspective. If it's a future orientation is near, then I would say it's almost like a problem-solving mode. It is needed in many instances. For example, when COVID came, the future orientation was almost near time, but it was very proactive at the same time, right? So there is a third axis to this 2x2 matrix of strategic decision mode and future orientation, which is also the policy axis, whether the policy is reactive or proactive. Now you may, in some sense, with the near term, you may start with a very reactive policy, but yet because of a particular need, for example, in our case, we had COVID, which had to be addressed. But as we went along, we also created some relatively long-term proactive measures, even in terms of vaccine creation. Again, it was in that time frame, it looks very short, but if you look at our policies of the health industry, for example, where we have a lot of generic manufacturers, we already had a lot of talent in creating, and we had lab facilities and all that. So the short-term policy enabled them to create a solution, and also it was able to do away with some of the required long-term tests for the immediate nature. But at the same time, when we are looking at UPI, right? UPI didn't happen overnight. The UPI started in 2011, almost like in 2011 when the initial effort started. But if you really see, the whole effort was the policy for introducing digital payment was all pegged upon the policy of 1983, Rangarajan Commission, which suggested that we need to go in for computerization of Indian banks. Now, the computerization of Indian banks led to the Indian banks coming on the digital framework, the policy for having core banking, again, all policies and which were forward-looking, and we were able to create UPI, and again, UPI was first talked about in, I think, 2012 or 2011. And of course, the first prototype was 2016, and then we started using it effectively. Now it is history, right? So there are policies which have a long-term orientation, which are proactive. So when we're looking at foresight and policy, this particular matrix, if you will, it's a 3x3. I mean, we could call it a 3x3. I just put the future orientation aspect, which is a temporal aspect. the strategic decision-making aspect, and seeing whether the policy axis, whether the policy needs is a reactive or proactive policy. So foresight is certainly essential for that axis, which includes future orientation, which is long-term, which is opportunity adoption and needs to be proactive. And of course, for some of them, other aspects for short term also, you might require some amount of foresight, but we are looking at foresight with a long-term perspective, depending on weak signals and trends at the current point of time. Now, given this, foresight can also inform whether the policy needs to be fluid or rigid to begin with itself. So during the policy initiation phase, during the policy creation phase, if it is future oriented, then there needs to be a certain amount of leeway or a certain amount of flexibility, so to speak, which needs to be there in the temporal flexibility, which needs to be in the policy formulation right from the beginning. And of course, implementation will vary from time to time. In fact, right now we have this largest Make in India policy or the mission, if you will. We have the performance linked incentive 1.0 and a performance incentive linked 2.0. All these policies are implemented, but the overall policy creation was Make in India kind of policy, which is driving that still. So we have temporal flexibility. Now, one was about bringing manufacturing to India. The second is now about component ecosystem manufacturing, right? So in some sense, you're looking at policies being fluid, and sometimes they need to be sometimes rigid. Again, I'll go back to the COVID, some of the policies we had to create, well, we can always argue whether some of them worked and some of them didn't work. But having said that, we had to bring in a rigid kind of basic guidelines document, and then we had to create implementing rules of engagement was created. So in that case, policy was informed by the long-term good. In some sense, we need to ensure that this is controllable, this is not spread. Of course, in that case, it was an immediate perspective, but we said in the next 3 years, we need to make sure everything is fine. So it became a rules of engagement. So in addition to looking at the policy axis proactive or reactive, we also look at foresight also informs whether the policy needs to have a fluid approach or a rigid approach. And there are a few foresight techniques, which are technology mapping, scenario analysis. These are all techniques which inform each other. It's not a single technique which may be the best, because depending on the context, a bunch of techniques can give you different perspectives, which can help you zero in on what path the policy, what choices the policy has to make, because every choice the policy makes has consequences, and which one example we will see down the way. So I very quickly go through the scenario planning aims at looking at a whole range of possibilities and uses foresight in context of volatility and change. And this is a largely qualitative exercise. Delphi method uses a lot of expertise coming in. In fact, I know that NCRPB's document for 2041 also was based on some of the Delphi method. They invited multiple experts. TIFAC used to do that for technology forecasting. And decision trees also is helpful in zeroing on certain choices based on the probability of paths which may occur, and helps in future oriented decision making. In some sense, decision making here can also be seen as policy for decision making. So from a technology road mapping, again, it depends on multiple technologies, how they converge, how they are growing, and we'll come to a particular, this is the S-curve for technology road mapping. Each technology, even in a particular space, may have different generations. For example, here she has shown a semiconductor, which went moved from a transistor to right now we have a very, very large scale integration kind of situation. I mean, application specific integrated circuits. So there are waves of technology, and when you look at foresight, when you look at 2047, if I'm right now, I'm here, the first tech, I mean, for want of things, this is 2020 right now, we are looking at some technologies, but we also need to identify some other technologies which are coming up, which may help us achieve our goal and take that as part of one of the axes for the policy formation. And policy formation requires, policy formation does require technology inputs as well, right? And there is another, again, there's a 3 horizon model in which you're looking at, the horizon is very contextual. Maybe in 2047 case, we can look at the horizon immediately from right now to 2030 in some sense, then from 2030 to 2040 and 2040 to 2047. Or again, it depends on the sub policies in technology area, in agriculture area, in bio, in maybe social welfare. And many of these policies may have a different horizon, but which ultimately need to converge in some sense at the long-term horizon. And in this case, I would say 2047 is too large a horizon for people to see. The policymakers can actually break it down into smaller chunks and look at it from what can be done in the next 5 years, what can the subsequent 10 years and the subsequent 10 years. That would give us an idea of where we are going. So there are foresight methods which are used for based on perspectives, which can be used, like SWOT, which is strength, opportunities, or threats, weakness, brainstorming, and backcasting is a very interesting thing. In fact, 2047 is some of the backcasting. I have said this is what I want to achieve. Now I'm going to come backwards and say what all I need to put in place so that I have created pathways to achieve the 2047 dream of a Viksit Bharat, a developed India. And that is a very nice example of backcasting, where I've created a preferred future. And I'm now coming back and casting what all I need to do in terms of, and here we have to do a lot of things, but in this talk, I would say what are the policies which we need to implement, and in terms of technology, in terms of education, in terms of social welfare, bunch health, and bunch of stuff. And there's also foresight techniques based on purpose. Some techniques like focus group, depending on a purpose, I can have collective judgments. Forecasting is again based on past data, still time series, which may inform our future view. Micro simulations can be done based on the current week, the events you see, week trends you see. We can simulate use various combinations of that, and of course risk assessment. And what are the challenges in taking, because I said foresight is a very it's a collaborative approach, it's a participative approach, that policy dynamics in adopting new initiatives and technologies sometimes comes from the fact that it is there's something called a not invented here syndrome. Many of us, because it requires multiple people with multiple functionalities, multiple departments, multiple stakeholders, both the society, maybe the NGOs, multiple people coming. Right now, policy making is influenced a lot even by corporate people. So where a lot of pushes and pulls are there, and there we have in this situation, the policy maker has to be very open to getting ideas from various places. So the policy dynamics right now is so high from various stakeholders coming in, that we need to understand that this could be a challenge, right? So to go back to one of the R. Vaidyanathan Iyer, who's again was a very eminent officer in our system. He has given the complexity of policy making, and he has given 5 rules. One is his view is don't rush into major decisions, don't foreclose options, consult as many as possible. Again, coming back, and one of the most thing is seek a longer term view. And he says again that is look at the longer haul. In that sense, and foresight becomes as a technique, as a conscious techniques to use in the policy making becomes very important. And I will. In interest of time, I'm just going to skip. I'll just give one example of a policy crossroad so that we appreciate why more interdisciplinary things is there. For example, we have this ethanol blended petrol, and the government said to reduce emission, we have to have at least 20% petrol. And this was a policy which has been adopted. And in that, they have relaxed environmental clearance applications. But that policy has had while trying to reduce pollution, has had a lot of impact on agriculture in places where the ethanol blended petrol factories are put up, and they are actually not treating the effluents because the environmental clearances does not is been relaxed, and it has not been told to treat the water properly, while they could do it themselves. So hence it says why the policy is very important to be sometimes rigid in such situations. If we have to have a long-term view also, is that trying to relax it in one place has an effect in another place, which is of course unintended, and hence foresight becomes a very necessary exercise before we do this. In fact, even in EV, if it's lithium-based factories, we need to see the life cycle assessment of lithium, end of life cycling, how do you recover it, because it causes a lot of damage to environment. So this is one ongoing example in trying to say why foresight-based decision making on what clearance to give and what not to give at the policy level can be looked at, right? Of course, we have a lot of good stories as well. From a policy point of view, we have a lot of missions: Make in India, National Mission on Artificial Intelligence, Quantum Frontier, Semiconductor, and all of them have multiple departments and ministries with policies in between. So when you're talking about a mission, in some sense, it is bringing in a foresight approach, because it at least brings in various participants into the fold and starts talking to each other. And at the same time, it's a good way to look at it from a long-term haul. So I think these are good things. hopefully we will be able to use more at various levels. People put on this foresight hat, use more foresight techniques, and make hopefully by 2047 use with a backcasting approach, we're able to create a foresight methods, foresight view based policies, which all of us will benefit from. Of course, there are some good trends which are happening. Uh, which I will, and for IIT Jodhpur has been using Foresight for Future of Cities projects to state, and we have taken multiple topics and scenarios and discussed and also created a model, and of that there is a particular sliver of AI for sustainable cities work which has been going, which is using multiple modeling, future views, simulation, real-time simulation, and a bunch of it, which informs the policy for sustainable cities. So with that, I will, I think I will, short over my time, I will just conclude here, and I think I will hand the floor back to Professor Rastogi. I hope I'm on time now.
Yes, so you're well in time. Thank you. I mean, the discussion is very. The session was on foresight, so to cover everything is, of course, a challenge. To cover anything is also a challenge. But thank you for introducing this concept to us, and especially in the arena of public policy. And the steps that you just spoke about were really important, especially for us also sitting here when we're working on some kind of advocacy for a policy. It's really important to know these. So next we have Dr. Venkat Ram Reddy, sir. He's going to speak on AI education and policy. Give the control to you, sir.
Right. Thank you, Professor Rastogi. I hope I'm audible. And good afternoon, all.
Good afternoon, sir.
Right. I hope you're able to see the screen. So the topic for the discussion today is essentially this idea of AI education and policy. Right? And
So screen is not visible. I mean, we can see you. If there is a presentation, we cannot see the presentation.
right. So maybe I'll just restart it. So, how about now?
It's visible now, sir.
Right. Thank you. Right. So the topic for the discussion today is AI education and policy. Right. And there are three aspects to this particular title. So what I'll do is I'll try and unpack these three aspects in the next few minutes. So let us start with this word called AI, or what we often refer to as artificial intelligence. And this is something that is being in the recent times everywhere, right? So whether it is news, whether it is media, whether it is content that we see on social media, whether it is technology out there, most of us, perhaps for the past few months or for the past couple of years, we would have either heard of this term, or we would have interacted with tools that we often refer to as AI, right? So if I have to just quickly check, tools like, for example, chat gpt and so on and so forth are tools that we broadly classify as AI. But the broad term of artificial intelligence does not limit to something that we see like ChatGPT. Right? There are many facets to it. Right? And very simply put, what is this idea of artificial intelligence? And if you have to reduce it to understandable terms, this is a simple flowchart that sort of puts in perspective. Right? And before I sort of bring in the key ideas in this flowchart, what it sort of points to is we have certain capabilities as human beings, right? So as humans, we can see visual scene and understand objects, try and understand the relationships between objects. So for example, if I'm looking at a playground and students playing there, I'm able to recognize who these students are, what are they playing, who is doing well and who is not doing well, and so on and so forth, right? Now that's a capability that I, as a human being, as a bystander watching a football match, is able to process that input and make sense of, right? Now, but the input is visual, right? In this case, there's no text, there's no audio, it's just visual input that I'm able to process. Now, if the same capability is endowed with a computer, right, or an algorithm that enables this machine to see and process visual input and make meaning out of that visual scene, now that's a use case of AI, right? Now, ChatGPT does not do it, right? ChatGPT does something else, but this very simple idea of replicating a human capability like vision is one facet of what we refer to as artificial intelligence. Right? Similarly, as a human being, we all hear sounds, make meaning out of sounds, and make put out behaviors in response to different kinds of sounds. Right? Similarly, if this capability is endowed with, if a computer gets to have this capability where it's able to hear us, make meaning of what we say, and the kinds of sounds that we put out, and then do something in response to that. Right? Now, that's again a use case of artificial intelligence. Right? The third use case that you could see here is similar to how we human beings read a piece of text, understand it, and respond back or make meaning out of that text. Similarly, if a machine can read the text that I give it and then respond back to me in a meaningful fashion, then that's another use case for artificial intelligence. Right? Something where tools like ChatGPT sort of do pretty well is they take in text like any questions that we have, any prompts that we tend to give to these tools that we broadly refer to as large language models. They tend to give one, they understand the prompts, and then once they understand the prompts or the text, they are able to respond back in a meaningful fashion, largely through text. Right? So that's another use case of AI. Right? Then we have another capability, right? So as human beings, we are endowed with a whole lot of capabilities: seeing, hearing, reading, moving from one place to the other. I use my legs, hands, and all the limbs that are there to be able to move from one place to the other. Right? Now, if a machine can do this, right? If a machine can move on its own from one place to the other, now that's essentially another use case of AI. Right? And similarly, if let's say I, as a human being, on a day-to-day basis, I make decisions of various kinds, right? So whether to attend this meeting or not, whether if I attend, what should I be, sort of saying, and so on and so forth. All of them are a sequence of decisions that we make. Right? Now, if there is a machine that can also make these decisions, maybe yes, right? So these are machines that make decisions, and then basis those decisions, they tend to act in certain ways. Right? So, for example, a classic case of machines making decisions is, on Amazon, if you go and search for products, and there are prices that are displayed against these products. Now, if you think for a moment and see who are these people who are putting these labels to those products on a site like Amazon, it's essentially an algorithm that is doing it on a day-to-day basis, right? So if you get onto Uber or any other application, and then you say, I want to move from this place to that place, and suddenly there's a price that props up saying this ride would cost you about 200 rupees or 500 rupees. Right? Now, who on earth is actually determining this price? Who is making the decision that this ride would cost so much? Now, that's not a human being, right? It's not like the driver who is actually picking you up is determining that price, nor is the owner of Uber is doing this. Right? It's somewhere in between, which is an algorithm which is doing this. Right? So there are use cases for algorithms, machines that these algorithms run on, making decisions for us all the time. Right? So if you think of all the kinds of capabilities that we human beings have, and if you say, can a machine have these capabilities? Right? That endeavor or that domain where we sort of try and endow human-like capabilities to machines is essentially the idea of artificial intelligence in the broadest sense. Right? While the world in the recent times we have seen is maybe one or two such capabilities, right? Thanks to ChatGPT and such kind of tools, we as human beings have got to access this kind of intelligence from the machine standpoint. But that doesn't mean that there are, no other use cases of AI. There are very strong use cases of AI from the standpoint of vision, from the standpoint of movements, and from the standpoint of decision making, and so on and so forth. Right now, that is sort of a good place to see. So what question, right? So now that we know that this domain is out there, there are people out there day in and day out trying to endow machines human-like capabilities. Then what does that even mean? Right? Why should we even bother about this? And that's where this idea would sort of bring to the table as to what are all the tasks that people do sort of tend to now get be done by these tools called artificial intelligence, right? As human beings, we tend to do a lot of things, different kinds of jobs, different kinds of roles, and a lot of tasks that these roles carry forward, right? So as a teacher, I tend to bring in knowledge to a classroom. As a call center employee, somebody is going to address concerns of a customer. Or as a lawyer, we are going to read through legal documents and then make sense of a case. Or as a, and frontline worker in a manufacturing setup, we are going to be part of an assembly where you're putting a piece to a large machine that somebody could use, right? Or as a researcher, you're analyzing through data and then making sense of. Now, if you see, these are all capabilities that we have that enable us to do all of these jobs, right? So the reason I am able to read a document and make sense of it and go out and speak in front of my students is because I have vision, is because I am able to hear, is because I am able to read, and is because I am able to move and decide. Now, suddenly, there's a machine that is capable of doing all of this, which means the implications are where the implications are for the kinds of tasks that we as human beings tend to look at. Right? So, now that's the reason why we are interested in looking at these capabilities. Why are we even talking about them at length? Is because suddenly we have a machine which can do a lot of things the way we do. Right? Now, that has a cross cutting impact on many other use cases than the ones that I've just listed out here, right? So if you think of these are standalone use cases of how a machine which has vision, what kind of impact can it have, which kind of jobs can it impact. Now, if I do a combination of this, which is more or less human-like, right? If I say, what if I give a machine vision and hearing, it can see and it can sort of hear and make sense, right? Then that has a certain multiplier impact on the kinds of industries, the kinds of jobs that it could impact. Similarly, if a machine can see as well as read a text, right, what kind of jobs and what kind of human activities or human endeavors can that sort of impact? Right? Similarly, if a machine can see and move from one place to the other, right, again, what kind of impact would that tend to have? Right? So something like a very strong use case of vision plus movement is what we often see when we talk about autonomous vehicles, right? An autonomous vehicle is in some dimension vision plus movement, of course many other capabilities, but what plays out strongly in an autonomous vehicle is this capability for the vehicle to see the world around and then move basis what it sees, right, and makes meaning out of it. Similarly, if you look at capabilities again as a combination of three such capabilities, right, again you will see that there is again a set of impact that these additional capabilities will bring to the table, right? Different other kinds of jobs and different other kinds of industries where they can sort of impact, right? And if you see the full-fledged scope of AI capabilities now, and if all of them are endowed in a particular use case, you'll see again a whole host of jobs that could be completely sort of automated. Right? While we started off with very simple cases of one such ability and its impact, we can also see a combinatorial use cases of various kinds of capabilities. If you mix and match, you will see a whole lot of jobs getting impacted. Right? When I say, when jobs get impacted, what does it even mean? Right? A lot of it means complementarity, which means if I am as a human being, I'm working on I'm taking up a role and I'm working as part of the role and I'm doing a set of tasks. Today, these AI tools or AI capabilities could help me do this better. Right? They might not be able to replace me completely. Like, for example, a customer support executive might have an AI tool in handy because that AI tool will go and fetch the product requirements or the product capabilities, the specifications, and then put it in a form that I can go back and address the concerns of the customer. Right? So, in some sense, most of these AI capabilities that we are talking about from a job perspective often tend to complement the human beings, which means they are not going to replace humans working in these jobs, but they are going to help them do their jobs better. Right? So, for example, as an academic now, I don't have to per se go out and create a presentation to take it into a class. Right? I can actually work with a large language model and then work with it to say what kind of topics am I going to teach my students. Can you bring in that know-how and then I can verify that know-how because I'm an expert in that domain, and then go back to the class using the large language model and the presentation that it has made for me. In some sense, it has reduced a certain manual effort that I, as an educator, would take. Right? So, a lot of these AI capabilities, as we see, are essentially about creating job complementarities. Now, what do we mean by job complementarities? As I said, essentially they will try and help us do our jobs better. Various kinds of jobs, various kinds of abilities in different combinations could help us do our jobs better, right? So for example, the customer support executive, the routine queries are answered by the chatbot, whereas only exceptional cases are brought to you as a human being, right? And this is something that we are seeing now. Whenever we take up a call and start talking to a customer support, quite often the initial set of conversations that we have with the customer support is actually with the algorithm that responds back, right? But only when the algorithm is not able to answer a certain specific query is when we are redirected to a human being. So in that sense, that's a complementarity that AI has created for that particular set of jobs. Similarly, in the case of healthcare, right? So if you think of the medical imagery and a computer vision algorithm trying to read imagery, like for example, a report like ECG and so on and so forth, then it is able to read that report and then give that information back to a radiologist who will actually confirm what exactly is going on with the imagery. So you have certain of these complementarities that are playing out now, and perhaps in the near future too, as we see. Now, why did I present all of this? Right? Because, as I said, the topic is largely about education and policy. But why did we start talking about AI? What are the capabilities of AI, and why do we think, what are the certain impact that it has in terms of the kinds of jobs, the nature of tasks, where does it help people, and so on and so forth? Is primarily to drive home a point that when all of this is playing out, how should we look at education and what we do in terms of education within a class? Right? When I know that my students are going to get into jobs that will inevitably look at some kind of a combination between human capability plus an artificial intelligent machine that they would work with, then how should this sort of change the way I think of education as an educator? What should we be doing collectively as educators or as policymakers to try and see what exact changes should we bring to the table in education? And why education? Because if you think of what we do for the first 24 years or 18 to 24 years of our lives, largely we spend in schools, colleges, universities. And why do we spend this time in schools, colleges, and universities? To able to get ourselves educated, skilled, so that we could become employable. Right? Most often than not, that's more or less the transactional purpose of education. While education could have a very broad, implication in terms of enabling us live better lives, but in a more pragmatic sense, essentially education paves way to jobs. Right? And if we know that these jobs are changing, the nature of the jobs and the kinds of tasks that we do as part of the jobs are changing, and most of this change is coming in because of the kind of AI capabilities that are coming into each of these jobs. Now, how do we as educators bring back these ideas to classroom? Right? And that's essentially what we'll try and look at in the next few minutes. Right? I'll stop here for any quick questions, because in the interest of time, maybe I can take a couple of minutes here, and then we'll see what is the state of education, the way we do it in India right now. What is the policy saying, and where should this policy be looking at in the near future to address some of these technology dimensions that are playing? Any quick?
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, sir. We have two questions in the chat box. One probably is for you, Venkat sir. It is how to increase in rural area use of AI in education.
Right. So I'll come to that maybe then after talking about the policy part of it. First, I'll try and present how do we educate ourselves right now, and this is cutting across school level education, high school and middle level, primary, high school, and university level education that we do in India. And whether it is a rural or an urban center, largely we do certain patterns. Right? There are certain patterns in the way we conduct our education on the ground. When you take, for example, the instructional approach from a teacher's standpoint, whether I am a teacher walking into a classroom in class 10th, or whether I'm a teacher walking into an undergraduate student program like one at IIT, largely we tend to look at teachers as information givers. Right? The teacher knows something, and the reason that he or she is coming to a class is to bring out that information to the students. That's one sort of a pattern that exists across the board. Right? Most of us look at our roles as more of information givers or knowledge givers, and there are people out there who are willing to listen, to give their time and money to listen to us. Right? And that's essentially one cornerstone of how instruction happens. Then most of it also tends to be one direction, because by definition the instructor looks at himself or herself as the knowledge giver. There is always a seeker who is going to listen. Right? It's often more or less passive or one directional instruction that we often tend to engage in. Right? And then we also have a standardized curriculum as to what is the boundary that we draw to this instruction. Right? How much as an instructor can I put out in the given point in time is governed by a policy which we often refer to as a curriculum, and that's standardized across different levels and so on and so forth. Right? And that gives a certain kind of structure to the learning path. Right? Which information needs to be put out when is determined by the curriculum, and the teacher sort of tends to follow that. And then anything beyond what they can do in the classroom, there is always a textbook that you can refer to. So this is more or less what goes on across the board, to my best understanding, whether it is schools, colleges, or universities at large, maybe with some exceptions. Largely, this is what we do as instructors. Right? And then, if you see the kinds of roles, as I said, teachers tend to be knowledge givers or knowledge dispensers. Students tend to be often passive recipients, and as administration in all levels tends to be more of process managers. Right? They tend to take care of the paperwork, whether it is in a school or in a college or in a university. And parents often, from our cultural standpoint, often tend to be performance monitors. Most often than not, the role of a parent in education often comes in at the end of the semester or at the end of the the term, where the performance of the student is put back to the parent, right? And which means the way the education sort of looks at the parent role is often as a performance monitor, somebody who can help the student perform better. And what do we mean by perform better? Again, most of the performance is linked to exams. So across the board, we often tend to evaluate what the students have learned in a class, often on the count of the concepts that the instructor has put out, whether the student is able to memorize these concepts and then come back in the exam on a stipulated date and time and put it out on a piece of paper. And then we sort of evaluate. We don't only evaluate the student, we'll also evaluate how other students are doing and then construct a comparative index, right? And then this, if they're able to do this well on that exam, then they move to the next class, right? And that's what we mean by credential oriented. They pick up credits over time, and at some point in time they graduate out of that school or the university. And this is essentially what goes on most often than not across. And that also points to what happens from a skill standpoint. What exactly do we often train our students in? Largely, it's on the content, right? The students are able to pick up the information, replicate that information in an exam. So, which means they're content driven, largely theory driven, as in they can always do it in the form of what's there in the textbook can be brought back in the exam. And these are all discipline focused and academic skills focused. At the end of the day, the skills that people pick up from education largely tends to be their subject matter, whether it is math or physics. Now, this is more or less portrayal of the education the way it happens across the board. Now, would this be sufficient, right? Given the changes that I have presented in the initial slides of how AI is going to come in and impact the kinds of jobs that we do, can we continue with these roles? Can we continue with these kinds of patterns across different levels of education? And the answer is no, right? Because most of the information is no longer with human beings as such, right? There's always a tool like ChatGPT or Claude or any of the large language models that can bring in that information to you on your doorstep, right? It's just on your mobile phone. All you have to do is ask it. It will say, it will bring out all the knowledge that exists in the humanity onto your phone or onto your device, right? So then would we even need an instructor to come and give us that kind of knowledge? Would we even need a textbook to sort of read and, come back in the exam and put up that set of answers in the exam, right? Perhaps no, right? Because there's already a tool that you can use, right? Similarly, in the past it was Google or any search engine that you can think of, but search engines had its own limitation, that it still required you to search and acquire information. But with large language models, which are a facet of AI, that information is readily given to you, right? You don't need to search and make sense of, you just have to read and you'll make sense of. So one impact that AI already has started having is no longer can instructors be information centered, where they look at their jobs as teachers or as educators as somebody who will give information to students, right? So that's some change that we are looking at. As educators, we should be able to see what kind of role can we play when I know that I can no longer be somebody who will take information to a class or knowledge to a class. I can't take a bunch of slides and go to a class, right? Because I should know that the students also have access to it, right? Then how do I see myself is one question. Similarly, if I know that the students can know everything, but what is that I, as a teacher, I can still do? If information is not something that I'm there to provide, then as a teacher, what should I be doing? That's where perhaps you can tend to look at this idea of learning design, where you tend to be more of facilitators, coaches than as instructors, right? And that calls for a qualitative change in the way we relate to our own roles, right? So that's one implication that we can look at. And on the other side, if you see the students, they also need to change, right? It's no longer the question of where you read something, memorize, and then come back and write in an exam and you go out and be successful. That's no longer going to be the case, because the world outside is not looking out for how much you know, because they also tend to have access to these tools that you have, right? So a lot of the jobs, the way these are changing, is the industry is also bringing in these tools for employees to take, sort of help off and then do their jobs. So then memorization and knowledge seeking is not the only goal that I as a student should be having. I should be able to do something more, right? And that's one impact that you can see from a student perspective. Similarly, the question on infrastructure, which will answer that question on the rural part, right? Now, how will we look at infrastructure that we provide in schools, in colleges, and in universities, right? Should it always be about buildings? Should it always be about having textbooks and so on and so forth? Perhaps no, right? There is a need for a certain change in the way we think of infrastructure that we should provide for schools, primarily which will unlock these AI capabilities, right? So maybe the infrastructure is no longer about having a school building and a room within it and then an attached toilet, because predominantly our struggle with primary and public education at large is to get those infrastructure in place across the board, and we have been doing this for the past 30-40 years. But today, maybe it's no longer about that. Maybe it's about creating a digital infrastructure that will enable the students access this knowledge that exists on these AI tools, right? So maybe the shift in infrastructure should be from a physical infrastructure count to a digital infrastructure count across the board. And that's when maybe the answer on how rural schools or rural colleges or rural universities, how would they be enabled with AI, is when they have access to these tools in the first place. And that's a minimum that we need to look at. Similarly, on the assessment count, right? As we said, exam-centric idea of assessment should move away, because again, memorization, understanding of a topic need not only be through a paper pencil based test. Right? There are other means now these AI tools sort of bring to the table that enable us test and do this in a better fashion, in a more relevant fashion for the world outside. So these are more or less the ideas coming out of my own research and my teaching with a lot of educators across the globe, across India, sorry, where quite often we start engaging with the educators and try and question them on some of these aspects, show them the AI tools that are there, and then see, what are the changes at the ground level from the standpoint of jobs, and how would we prepare our children to pick up those jobs and become more employable over time. Right? So I will stop here because we have more or less covered the entirety of what I thought I could do in this slot. And then we'll open up for any questions post this. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I believe most part of the questions posted in the chat box, that includes Mr. Shiv Kumar's question and Mr. Pankaj Kumar sir's question, is covered. Two things maybe Balaraman sir can comment on. One is Dr. Mallikarjun is asking, is fluid policy good or rigid policy good for national development? And a part of Mr. Shiv Kumar's question is on technology adoption in sectors like IT jobs and education, which are still working through traditional structures. So on these two, we would want you, sir, to comment. Balaraman, sir.
Okay, thank you for that. Whether the fluid policy is good or rigid policy is good, the answer is, of course, it's subjective and dependent on the context. Sometimes certain social requirements social requirement-based policy tend to be rigid, even though it's long term. There are certain policies like that. Whereas if a policy needs to maintain its efficacy in the long term, it has to be flexible in the sense that it has to address evolving situations and be relevant. So from that sense, I would say on a relative basis, a fluid policy which maybe in the short term needs to be rigid for a certain, but allows for fluidity or interpretation in the long term, depending on contextual developments, societal developments, or technology developments, is maybe a better approach for national development. Of course, that is subjective on certain. It's also subjective. So in a general way, I think fluid policy tends to give a larger direction for the national development, especially since we are a federal structure and we have concurrent lists. So it gives certain amount of degrees of freedom for various participants to also create policies which are relevant to their area. So I would say overall fluid policy tends to be a bit more long-term oriented. So I would bet for that for the long term. Yeah. And with respect to the other one is IT jobs. IT jobs are going. I mean, in fact, it's been told by both I think Infosys head Parekh and I think HCL head a couple of weeks back in NASSCOM, that the old business model is gone. And they're trying to do more with less people, especially on the AI-based systems and all that kind of things coming. It's been publicly stated. So from that point of view, if you're looking at a business model of the IT industry in terms of the policies of putting more people into the job, that's not going to work anymore, because we need to see how people, like Dr. Venkat Ram Reddy has mentioned, how do you create the education system so people are able to build upon the knowledge which is created by these systems like AI systems and automated systems, and what value add do you do? And that is where the future of these sectors will be dependent upon. Of course, the education sector has to undergo the policy has to really look at the evolving changes, because the changes are evolving very rapidly. It's not 1 year, or it's almost every month, every other week, things are changing in the AI space. So I think we need to have a very sharp look at that, and policymakers really need to even look at NEP from a evolving AI filter, because NEP was 2020, and between 23 and 25, AI systems have gone up so much. So I think The old IT job model, not relevant anymore, evolving, we need to see how we need to look at. And policymakers really need to have this very forward-looking view for the next 20 years of where this is going, and actually maybe even tweak or reposition the policy, especially in the education sector. That would be
One maybe comment or question, sir, from my side. In sectors such as education, healthcare, and I come from mental health space, and also a little bit of background on AI. I have a little bit understanding of it. I see that a lot of innovations happening in the sense of AI is to humanize it, to develop a sense of consciousness. So, for example, if I am having a chat bot for any service, how can I humanize it and it feels like I'm talking to a human? So, that component is inevitably irreplaceable, or are we not ready to replace it? Why are we not, like, this is an AI, this is, I would not say a synthetic system, but yes, let me go ahead and say it is a synthetic system that I'm interacting with. Then why do I need to humanize it and make it feel like I'm talking to a human? A comment on it, sir.
Again, one is from the marketing perspective, of course. Especially humanizing it in areas of education can have a lot of benefits, because when a student is able to relate to that AA agent, which is very individual AA agent, which is how we need to scale up education, and feels that it is humanized and is able to understand the needs of the person. From that perspective, you can have a lot of good benefits, also almost like an individual teacher with the student. And one-on-one education has proven to be very effective. Research also says one-on-one education is much more effective than a group education in many ways, right? Individual attention, so to speak. Having said that, there are other areas where humanizing it is also leading to a lot of legal issues, or we say societal issues. In fact, yesterday there's a report which said that more you use these chatbots, AI chatbots, the more lonely you are, or because you're using it, the more lonely you get, or more lonely people use this more. There's this perspective which is coming up, right? There is a lot of mental health issues also coming up, and there has been some instances where people are starting to fall in love with their agents. Apparently, I mean, these are maybe very. So yes, there is a lot of mental health issue also associated with overuse of this, like any social media, just like any device, like anything else. But there is humanizing it certainly has its advantages, especially in healthcare as well, right? Instead of being a robotic healthcare taker in the future, maybe a humanized healthcare taker can be can look at a patient very subjectively and give them a very humanized response. It does have advantages. So hence, from that point of view, also, for example, autonomous cars are run by AI agents in some sense, right? And sometimes they have to take very tough decisions on the road, perhaps. So we need to have a humanized approach to how humans would take a decision, has to be built into those choices and those decisions and a spot decision which they may be doing. So humanizing AI does have its advantages, but of course, we have a long discussion ahead, and hopefully Foresight will tell us we'll not make too much mistakes with humanizing it and know where to stop it as well.
Well put, sir. So, thank you once again for joining in to all the participants, and thank you to both our eminent speakers for a very futuristic and comprehensive understanding. I would say both the foresight and the AI tech side were education, healthcare, and the focus has been education, but policy, all the components have been holistically included. So thank you to both these speakers for sparing time for this discussion. This is our monthly kind of dose for information dissemination and generating some discussions on very, very interesting topics. So thank you once again, sir, for joining, and thank you to all the participants. We will be in the next webinar with the IIT Bombay. So thank you, sir. So we will close. Thank you, everybody, for the time.
Thank you so much.